In the suffocating heat of the South Carolina summer of 1716, 14 of the colony's wealthiest plantation masters arrived at the Grayfield estate. On the surface, it was just another gathering business as usual among men who believed themselves untouchable. But none of them would ever leave that room alive. 3 days later, when the estate was finally breached, what investigators found was something that even hardened colonial officials struggled to describe. The bodies of all 14 men were discovered burned beyond recognition, their remains arranged in a precise circle around a massive coal furnace. Their wrists bore the bite of iron shackles, their mouths cruelly stuffed with raw cotton, as if to silence them even in death, and there was only one living soul left on the property. In the kitchen, sitting quietly, was a woman named Esperanza de Lima, an enslaved servant. She was calm, humming a soft Portuguese lullaby while sharpening a set of kitchen knives with eerie patience. When questioned, she uttered only a single phrase in halting English. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete. The case files of what became known as the Grayfield Massacre were sealed almost immediately by order of Governor Robert Johnson. For more than 2 centuries, they remained hidden deep within Charleston's archives. But tonight, we will unseal that silence. Tonight, we return to the night that shook colonial South Carolina to its core. A night of vengeance so precise and so brutal, it changed the way an entire colony thought about its enslaved population. Before we dive deeper into the story of Esperanza de Lima, I want to ask you something. If you're new here, take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell, so you don't miss stories like this, stories buried by time, erased by those in power but still demanding to be told. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Are there dark forgotten histories lingering in your own backyard? Now let's return to the beginning. To understand Esperanza's act of revenge, we must first understand where she came from. Our story doesn't begin with fire and ash in 1716, but 15 years earlier in the bustling port of Charleston. The year was 1701. The colony was flush with wealth, its prosperity built on the brutal labor of enslaved Africans, working rice plantations that stretched across the low-country swamps. Among the richest of these planters was Edmund Grayfield, a second-generation colonist whose family had carved out a 3,000-acre empire north of the Ashley River. Edmund towered over most men, over 6 feet tall, with piercing pale eyes that seemed to look through, not at those who stood before him. His cruelty was legend. Even in an era already defined by brutality, Grayfield was whispered about. His estate had a reputation. Slaves sent there either perished within a year or survived as broken hollow shells. That September, a Portuguese slaver named Santa Maria docked in Charleston Harbor with its human cargo, 180 souls from the coast of Angola. Among them was a young woman, no more than 20, who would be given the name Esperanza de Lima by her new master. To the colonists, she seemed unremarkable. Of average height, sturdy in build with intelligent eyes and delicate scarification across her shoulders, marks they dismissed, but which in truth told a story of royal descent. They had no idea she was the daughter of a chief trained from childhood in strategy, in negotiation, and in knowledge the Europeans mocked as witchcraft, but which was in fact a profound mastery of herbs, poisons, and human psychology. Esperanza had seen her village burned, her father cut down, her people chained. To her, every pale face carried the weight of that night. Edmund Grayfield purchased her for £42 sterling, a high sum reflecting her youth and apparent health. His intent was clear. His former house servant, an older woman named Sarah, had died just weeks earlier. Officially, it was from natural causes. But everyone on the estate knew the truth. Sarah had been beaten to death for spilling wine on his imported carpet. From her first day at Greyfield, Esperanza began what would become a 15-year campaign of silence, patience, and calculation. She learned English with astonishing speed, though she pretended to understand little. She listened more than she spoke. She watched every gesture, remembered every insult, every cruelty. And she took note of every name, whispered in Greyfield's circle of influence. She was no longer a princess, no longer free, but Esperanza de Lima was far from powerless. The Greyfield estate was more than just Edmund Greyfield's home. It was the hidden heart of colonial South Carolina's power structure. Behind its grand facade, the plantation served as the meeting place for a secretive group of men who called themselves the Rice Council. This council, 14 strong, represented the wealthiest and most ruthless planters in the colony. Their reach extended far beyond their fields. They controlled agricultural policy, manipulated rice prices, set the rules for enslaved labor, and shaped the very political future of South Carolina. They answered to no one, not even the crown. In their eyes, they were kings. At the head sat Edmund Greyfield, feared and respected in equal measure. Around him gathered men whose names carried weight like thunder in the colony. William Petton, whose estate produced more rice than any other in the Americas. James Rutherford, planter and colonial judge who enforced the law while profiting from breaking it. Marcus Sutton, the region's largest slave trader who trafficked in human lives with chilling efficiency. Henry Caldwell, whose political influence reached all the way to the governor's office. Thomas Harrington, once a British naval officer who ran his plantation as though it were a fortress. Benjamin Fairfax, heir to one of the oldest fortunes in the colonies. Samuel Kingsley, infamous for seasoning newly arrived Africans, breaking their spirits for resale. Robert Fielding, a sadist known for developing elaborate methods of torture. Charles Warwick, whose land bordered 3 other estates, making him a hub of information. Jonathan Crichton, who meticulously recorded slave breeding programs as if managing livestock. David Norris, a physician who used his medical training not for healing, but to prolong the labor of enslaved workers until they could give no more. Alexander Hartwell, whose plantation doubled as a prison for recaptured runaways. And the youngest, George Baxter, only 35, whose unrestrained appetite for cruelty earned him a swift place among the council's inner circle. These men were not merely cruel, they were organized, cold, systematically evil. To them, human beings were machinery, something to be optimized, repaired, or discarded. Their monthly councils became grotesque workshops of exploitation. They compared notes on calorie rations that kept slaves alive, but weak. They argued over which punishments produced obedience most efficiently. They even laughed as they shared stories of families torn apart and lives extinguished. For 15 years, Esperanza de Lima moved silently among them. She served their meals, poured their wine, and cleared their plates. To them, she was invisible, but she was listening. Every cruel boast, every whispered plan, every scrap of information They all became part of the ledger she kept in her mind. She heard the laughter when they spoke of children sold like livestock. She memorized the patrol schedules they discussed, the price adjustments they planned, the legal changes they prepared to enact. Each detail was a weapon, and Esperanza was sharpening them with every passing month. And yet, despite years of darkness, she managed something that her owners believed impossible. She held on to her humanity. She even found something more, something dangerous and beautiful love. In the spring of 1715, she met a young man known in the plantation ledgers only as Boy Tom. His true name was Wame, and he had been born into bondage on the Rutherford estate. By then, he was 22, tall and strong with a mind that refused to break. Against all odds, Wame had learned to read secretly taught by an overseer who had once shown rare kindness before his death. Wame carried that knowledge like a flame, using it to teach others letters and numbers in stolen hours of rest on Sundays. For Esperanza, Wame was more than a companion. He was proof that dignity could survive in chains. Their relationship began cautiously in stolen glances and whispered exchanges disguised as work. Soon they created a secret language of songs and gesture signals that seemed ordinary to white observers but carried coded meaning routes of escape, safe contacts, opportunities for resistance. By the end of 1715, what they had built together was remarkable. Esperanza used her place in the Rice Council's dining room to feed Wame intelligence patrol timetables, changes in colonial law, the vulnerabilities of neighboring estates. Wame, often loaned out for heavy labor across plantations, carried that information into the fields, weaving a clandestine network of knowledge and hope among the enslaved. Together, they were no longer just surviving, they were preparing. What Esperanza and Wame were planning was unlike anything the colony had ever seen. This was not an escape for two frightened souls. It was the beginning of a carefully plotted uprising, one that could spread across multiple plantations and liberate hundreds. They had mapped escape routes, identified sympathetic whites willing to offer aid, and even established contact with free black communities in Spanish Florida who promised sanctuary for those who could reach their territory. For months, every detail had been sharpened like a blade, but all of it was shattered by a single announcement. On March 15th, 1716, at the monthly gathering of the Rice Council, Edmund Greyfield declared his latest plan. With a smile cold as iron, he revealed that he intended to expand his breeding program. Certain women on his estate, he boasted, had been chosen to produce what he called superior stock. These women would be moved into a guarded compound paired with selected men from other plantations and monitored until they bore children bred for strength and endurance. At the top of that list was Esperanza de Lima. She stood only feet away, pouring wine as the men laughed and clapped each other on the back. Her face betrayed nothing, but inside her, something that had survived 15 years of slavery. Her last fragile thread of hope snapped. That night, beneath a fallen cypress, deep in the rice fields, she met Wame. The frogs, the insects, and the night birds covered their whispers as Esperanza told him of Greyfield's plan. They both understood immediately what it meant. Once she was locked in the breeding compound, their secret meetings would end. Their intelligence network would collapse. The uprising they had been weaving with such care would die before it ever began. Desperation clawed at them. Wayne urged that they flee at once. He had secured contact with a Spanish trader who could ferry them to St. Augustine. Within a week, they could be free. They could begin again, build a life away from Greyfield's cruelty. From safety perhaps, they might even help others. But Esperanza shook her head. In their native Portuguese reserved only for the most intimate truths, she said, "Running saves us, but it changes nothing for our people." Her eyes were steady, burning with a resolve that frightened him more than the thought of death itself. She spoke of the council's laughter as they discussed tearing apart families, of the casual cruelty with which they spoke of torture, of their endless plans to expand the trade in flesh. "I know their patterns," she whispered. "I know their secrets. I know when they are vulnerable. We have one chance, one to send a message they will never forget. One chance to make them feel the fear they have sown into us." Wayne was terrified, not of dying slaves lived each day with death's shadow, but of what would come before death if they were caught. He had seen the punishments meted out to those who resisted the slow, brutal tortures designed to break not just bodies, but the spirits of every enslaved person forced to watch. And yet, he also knew she was right. Running would save 2 lives, but leave the system unbroken. Her way, impossible and terrifying as it was, could deliver a blow that might ripple across the colonies. A strike so daring, so unforgettable, it could not be ignored. For 2 weeks, they labored in secret. What they built together was not just a plan, it was a weapon. Part intelligence operation, part psychological strike, part act of war. Esperanza would use her invisibility at the council table to open the door. Worm would provide the materials, the timing, the safety nets for allies who risked everything to help them. Piece by piece, their design took shape, perhaps the most intricate and dangerous act of resistance ever attempted in colonial America. And at its core lay one simple truth Esperanza had learned in 15 years of silence. The Rice Council had grown careless. Their arrogance was their blind spot. Believing themselves untouchable, they had let down their guard. And that was precisely when she would strike. June 23rd, 1716. The day that would end it all. Dawn broke heavy, and suffocating the air, so thick with heat, it seemed to cling to the skin like wet cloth. South Carolina's summers could bring even the strongest Europeans to their knees. But for those stolen from equatorial Africa, the heat was an old familiar companion. Esperanza de Lima rose before the sun just as she had every morning for the last 15 years. Yet this morning, every movement carried a different weight. This was no longer routine. This was preparation. Today was the culmination of every whispered plan, every silent observation, every year of swallowed rage. The Rice Council would meet at Greyfield Estate that afternoon. 14 men, the lords of the colony, would arrive by carriage and horseback, ready to set the price of rice debate, the treatment of human chattel, and drink Edmund Greyfield's imported rum late into the night. Esperanza had spent weeks dissecting their habits as though she were an anatomist preparing for surgery. She knew Marcus Sutton would come early to whisper private deals in Greyfield's ear. She knew Benjamin Fairfax, with his failing bladder, would excuse himself like clockwork every 90 minutes. She knew rice prices always came before dinner, while the cruelties of slave management were saved for after the rum had loosened tongues and loosened inhibitions. But above all else, she knew the furnace. Greyfield's pride and joy imported brick by brick from Britain. The coal furnace towered in the estate's vast kitchen, 8 feet of fire brick and iron, capable of burning hotter than any wood fire in the colonies. Greyfield loved to boast that it could reach 2000 degrees, hot enough to melt copper, hot enough to melt silver. He showed it off to visitors as proof of his refinement and wealth. What he did not know, what he could never have imagined, was that for months Esperanza had been studying it in secret, learning its breath, learning how to choke it with air or feed it to a white-hot fury. And quietly, piece by piece, she had stockpiled coal under the overseer's noses, claiming Greyfield himself had ordered extra for a coming expansion of the kitchens. 3 days before the meeting, everything narrowed to a single desperate point. James Rutherford, with his ever-expanding fields, had persuaded Greyfield to sell him Boy Tom. 60 sterling for one of the strongest men on the estate. The transaction would be sealed after the council meeting, with Wame transferred to Rutherford's plantation the very next morning. When Esperanza learned the news, she felt the last of her choices vanish. She would lose the man she loved. She would be forced into Greyfield's breeding program, reduced to flesh for producing flesh. And the council would go on unchecked, grinding countless lives into dust. That night, beneath the fallen cypress tree that had been their secret refuge, she and Wame met for what both knew would be the last time. They spoke in hushed tones, compressing 15 years of unspoken dreams into a few fleeting hours. Wame begged her, pleaded with every shred of hope he had left. Run with me. There is still time. We can reach Spanish Florida. We can be free. But Esperanza's voice was steady, harder than the steel she had polished in Greyfield's dining room. These men believe they are gods, she whispered in Portuguese, their private language. If we run, they remain gods. If we fight, if we strike at their very heart, we remind them they can bleed. They believe they can do anything to us without consequence, Esperanza whispered. Tomorrow I will show them they are wrong. I will show them that we are human beings, not animals. And when human beings are pushed beyond endurance, we fight back. Wame heard the steel in her voice and knew the truth. There was no more persuading her. He had known Esperanza for less than 2 years, but long enough to recognize when her mind was unshakable. So instead of arguing, he did what he could in the final hours together. He helped her refine the last details of her plan. At dawn on June 22nd, Esperanza began her final preparations. She moved with quiet precision, taking a full inventory of the kitchen and adjoining storage rooms. Every tool, every pot, every ingredient that could be repurposed was noted. Most chillingly, she catalogued the iron shackles and chains kept in the pantry, implements used to restrain slaves during punishment, kept close at hand by the masters. She also studied the kitchen's layout and the movement of the domestic slaves, ensuring that when her moment came, no innocents would be caught in the firestorm she was about to unleash. Then came the furnace. From the break of day, Esperanza began stoking coal into Greyfield's prized furnace. At first, her actions appeared routine, just another day of preparation for a council feast. But behind her calm movements was a careful rhythm, feeding the flames at timed intervals, gradually driving the furnace toward its peak. By late morning, it roared with an invisible fury. its heart white hot, its heat capable of melting metal. No one noticed. Esperanza was known for her quiet, methodical work. The other servants thought nothing of her diligence. She cleaned the dining room, polished the imported crystal glasses, set the heavy oak table with precision. Everything looked the same as it always did. But beneath the surface, the estate had been turned into a trap waiting to be sprung. By noon on June 23rd, the predators began to arrive. The first was Marcus Sutton, his horse's hooves striking down the oak-lined avenue with a sound as arrogant as the man himself. Sutton was 53, heavy-set, from decades of indulgence, his face ruddy with rum and power. But his eyes remained sharp, the eyes of a man who had built his fortune on cruelty, refined into a science. His plantation specialized in seasoning, the brutal breaking of newly arrived Africans, turning human beings into obedient property. Other planters sent their unruly stock to him for correction, paying him to destroy the last flickers of defiance in those who resisted bondage. Greyfield greeted Sutton with elaborate courtesy, the false politeness of men who treated each other as gentlemen while reducing thousands of others to beasts. Together, they vanished into Greyfield's private study, speaking in low tones about matters too dark even for the council chamber. New methods of discipline, new ways to squeeze more profit from flesh and blood. New petitions to the colonial government to ease restrictions on the human trade. One by one, the others followed. William Peyton arrived with his overseers ever paranoid after a rebellion had nearly erupted on his estate. James Rutherford came alone, but his horse carried silver-mounted pistols, gleaming symbols of his dual power as both planter and magistrate. Henry Caldwell rolled up in a gaudy carriage painted with his family's crest, a hollow display of noble pretension, meant to remind everyone of his political ties. By the time the last carriage pulled into Greyfield's circular drive, the house was alive with the sound of laughter, greetings, and casual conversation, weather crops and complaints about the Indian problem on the frontier. The Rice Council had gathered. 14 men of power seated at their table, unaware that beneath their feet a furnace was burning, like the heart of a volcano, and Esperanza de Lima was waiting. These men saw themselves as the founding fathers of a new civilization. They saw themselves as pioneers turning the wild forests into rice paddies that fed the growing cities of the New World. But what they tried to hide and never even admit was that their civilization was built on a foundation of blood and chains. Their wealth came not from their own ingenuity, but from the sweat, tears, and lives of thousands of people who had been turned into tools. Their political power existed only to protect and expand this machine of oppression. At exactly 200 p.m., Edmund Greyfield rose and clapped his hands to signal the start of the meeting in the opulent dining room. 14 men sat around a huge oak table imported from England at a cost enough to feed a colonial family for years. The candlelight from dozens of silver candelabras cast a false grandeur on the polished tabletop, a light that made them feel noble, powerful, almost divine. Esperanza, as silent as a shadow, began her usual routine, pouring wine, changing plates, serving steaks and red wine. On the surface, she was still the perfect servant, her face expressionless, her steps light. But inside, every word that reached her ears today was like a red-hot knife carving into her heart. The meeting began as it had always done, discussing the price of grain in Charleston. Strategies for maximizing profits during the harvest. William Petton boasted about his record-breaking performance slicing imported beef while talking endlessly about incentive management, giving a little food to slaves who exceeded their quota and whipping those who fell behind. The key, he insisted, is to give them just enough hope to keep working, but never enough to feel safe. James Rutherford nodded in agreement, raised his glass and added, "I use the method of separating families. Nothing makes a slave work harder than knowing his wife and children are kept elsewhere and will only be reunited if he works hard." For nearly an hour, the room was filled with a language as cold as steel. The secrets of managing people were discussed as casually as if discussing crops or livestock. Breeding plans were spoken in a scientific tone, as clear as entries in a manual. Punishments were described with a sick enthusiasm, like craftsmen showing off their new techniques. Esperanza continued to clean quietly, pouring more wine, but in her mind, she recorded every habit, every smile, every drunken nod. Every detail became a link in a plan that had been prepared for years. Then came the side stories, the breaks in which they boasted of their own cruelty. Marcus Sutton proudly told of a new torture device imported from the Caribbean. A small iron cage hung in the sun that turned people into living corpses that were slowly cooked over several days. Samuel Kingsley laughed, boasting of his experiments in breeding stronger slaves by forcing them to mate. But it was George Baxter, the youngest member whose face still had the confidence of his 30s, who threw the final spark. As Esperanza poured the brandy after dinner, he stood up, his voice full of excitement. "Gentlemen, I have some very exciting news. The Spaniards are paying a high price for experienced slaves in South America. I propose that we pool our resources, buy a large ship, and begin a systematic exportation of old goods, of unproductive people." In that moment, Esperanza knew the time had come. The room exploded with excited chatter. 14 men eagerly calculated the huge profits they could make from selling their walking assets to the Spanish colonies, where working conditions were even more brutal. They discussed licenses, politics, how many slaves they could dispose of, and still keep enough workers on the fields. And at that moment, something inside Esperanza snapped. For 15 years, she had held on to a fragile belief that there must be a limit to this cruelty, that even the most evil men would stop somewhere before crossing the final frontier of humanity. But no, there were no limits. They were only held back by profit and their own dark imaginations. Enough. It was time for them to taste the powerlessness they had sown. At exactly 9:47 p.m., according to the precious German clock in the dining room, Esperanza made her move. The room was now filled with cigarette smoke, flickering candles, and sparkling brandy. The rulers had taken off their ties and stretched out in the comfortable posture of those who believed themselves to be absolutely safe. They were discussing enthusiastically the creation of a seed book to breed a generation of healthier and more obedient slaves. A cold, almost scientific discussion, as if they were talking about rice seeds, not people. No one noticed when Esperanza bowed slightly and left the dining room saying she would get more brandy. No one saw her bolt each door, leaving only the kitchen as the only exit. No one knew that throughout the evening she had been steadily adding more coal to the stove, raising the temperature to a dangerously red-hot level. And no one knew that the brandy swirling in their glasses had been laced with an ancient herbal concoction, her grandmother's recipe, that would put anyone to sleep for a few hours but wake up fully lucid to face the horrifying truth. A few minutes later, George Baxter, the greediest of all, was the first to feel dizzy. He smiled wryly, blaming the alcohol, but then collapsed his eyelids heavy. Next came William Patton, clutching his stomach and complaining of nausea. Rutherford rubbed his eyes, unable to see clearly. Marcus Sutton's hands shook uncontrollably. And finally, Edmund Greyfield. His face red, struggled to utter a few broken words. "Gentlemen, I think we have been..." Before he could finish, he collapsed onto the luxurious Persian carpet, the price of a year's labor for dozens of colonial families. In just 20 minutes, all 14 were unconscious. Esperanza worked like a shadow, tirelessly. She pulled at the chains binding each wrist, each ankle, with the same tools that had imprisoned thousands of lives over the years. Carefully, tightly tight enough to cause pain, but not so tight that they would be freed by a quick death. This was not instant revenge. This was a long sentence. As she locked each heavy body, she whispered in their ears in Portuguese, Spanish, and halting English. To Rutherford, she leaned close. "You sold my son like cattle. Tonight, you will learn what it means to be sold to become nothing." To Marcus Sutton, her voice choked. "You break the spirit of others, teach them to stop being human. Tonight, I will teach you what it means to have a broken spirit." And when it came to Edmund Greyfield, who had owned her for 15 years, Esperanza let her hatred flow. "You thought you could do anything to me. You thought I was just an animal. Tonight, you will see what animals do when they are pushed to the limit." 3 hours later, 14 heavy bodies were dragged step by step to the kitchen. At 2 a.m., they lay in a circle around the red-hot coal stove, feet facing the center, hands tied behind their backs, mouths stuffed with cotton to stifle their cries for help. The kitchen was steaming so hot that their flesh burned just from breathing. Esperanza had calculated carefully the heat, the thirst, the shackles. All would make them suffer slowly, dragging out the hours of despair. But she also prepared a quicker punishment to make sure no one escaped. And then, in the silvery grey light of the first dawn, Edmund Greyfield opened his eyes. For a few seconds he thought he was dreaming, until he felt the iron chains cutting deep into his flesh, the sweltering heat from the furnace, and all around him. 13 other distorted faces were also slowly waking up. The nightmare had begun. The huge brazier in the middle of the kitchen glowed red like a miniature version of hell. As the men awoke one by one, the room was filled with muffled moans and the desperate clanging of chains. For the first time in their lives, they experienced the feeling of absolute helplessness, the feeling they had inflicted on thousands of other souls. Esperanza sat calmly in the corner of the kitchen, leisurely sharpening the knives used for butchering and cooking. The blades glinted in the firelight, reflecting in the eyes of each of the men tied up. She let them look straight at her and slowly realized the terrible truth today. They were the prey. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said. her voice clear and fluent in the English they had never heard from her mouth before. I hope you have had enough rest, because today we have a lot to talk about. She stood up and walked slowly around the circle, her cold eyes scanning each sweaty face. Her words fell heavy as knives. For 15 years I have stood in your meetings. I have listened to every story. I have heard you talk about us like cattle, buying, selling, breeding, slaughtering, for your own convenience and your own pocketbook. She stopped at Marcus Sutton, who was struggling helplessly. You are a soul breaker. You turn people into empty shells capable of nothing but obedience. You teach people to forget that they were ever human. Then came James Rutherford, and you. You use the division of families as a tool. You tear fathers from sons, husbands from wives. You know a man without a family is easier to control. And you call it management. Every name she mentioned, every crime she read was a knife to their memory. Strangled screams filled the kitchen. Finally, she stopped before Edmund Greyfield, the master of the house, the master of all evil. And you had a choice. You had education, you had power, you had money. You could have chosen to be humane, but you chose to be a monster, because monsters are more profitable. Esperanza returned to stand in front of the brazier, the heat sizzling against her face, but she did not flinch. Today, you will learn what it means to be helpless. You will understand what it means to live in the hands of someone who sees you as less than human. And you will die slowly, painfully, with plenty of time to remember everything you have done. The nightmare began. For the next 6 hours, the Greyfield kitchen became a theater of revenge. Esperanza tortured them not with whips, but with memories. She spoke in a calm tone as if reading a crop report. Mr. Petton, do you remember the girl named Asha? You bought her when she was pregnant. You made her work in the fields until she gave birth. As soon as the baby was born, you sold it to a trader from Georgia. She cried for 3 days, and you ordered her to be whipped for disturbing your sleep. Petton's eyes widened, and his throat made a choking noise in the cotton. He remembered. He remembered everything. Then came Charles Warwick. And you. You considered beatings entertaining. You once paid Greyfield 5 shillings just to personally give a runaway 50 lashes to his back. You dragged out each stroke so he wouldn't faint, so the pain would build. And you laughed all the while. Sweat, tears, and horror streaked the sumptuous robes. The heat from the coal stove turned the kitchen into a veritable hell. Some were panting eyes glazed with exhaustion. But Esperanza did not stop. She took out a leather-bound notebook, Edmund Greyfield's own. Turning the pages, she read aloud, her voice steady and cold. April 12th, 1715. Sold a boy named Caesar, age 14, to Rutherford plantation for breeding. Price £45 sterling. Note: mother became unruly after separation. Suggests sale or immediate disposal. She turned to another page. June 3rd, 1715. A woman named Rebecca died in childbirth. Child survived. Loss of £20. Note: improved rations for breeding machines to reduce mortality. Page after page. The lines were as cold as a commercial transaction, But behind them were lives shattered, families crushed in the machinery of slavery. Each word was a sentence. Each number is a soul erased. And now, the people who wrote them sit in hell, forced to listen to every word they left behind. The mental torture lasted for 2 hours. Esperanza forced each man to confront the full extent of his crimes. Her extraordinary memory, honed by 15 years of listening, turned every detail into an invisible blade, dates, names, barbaric acts. All of them were as clear as if they had happened yesterday. As the sun rose and the temperature in the kitchen reached nearly 120 degrees Fahrenheit, Esperanza moved on to the next stage. She went into the storeroom and took out long iron bars, used to poke the coals and lift large pots. Each bar was placed directly into the fire. In an instant, they glowed red, like trapped sunbeams. Gentlemen, her voice boomed steadily. You have spent your lives thinking of ways to inflict pain without killing your victims. You have become masters at sustaining pain. Today, I will show you how well my students have listened. She pulled out a bar. Red light bounced off the walls, the heat stifling the air. Esperanza moved closer to Edmund Greyfield, holding the bar just inches from his face, enough to make him feel as if his skin was on fire. This is for every human you branded like cattle. This is for every soul you called property. Then, a scream tore through the kitchen. The scream echoed out into the fields, where the slaves who had been working hard stopped and looked up in horror. They had never heard such powerful men scream. Esperanza worked slowly, carefully. Each bar was applied to a non-fatal but excruciatingly painful spot. The hands, the feet, the face. She knew exactly how much the human body could take, having learned the torture techniques they had bragged about in their meetings. In between changing the bars, she continued her verbal torture. The voice was calm, almost whispering. Marcus Sutton, your son William is only 16. Maybe there is still time for him to be different from you. Maybe when he learns how his father died, he will understand that it is dangerous to treat others as objects. Those words were like a knife piercing the heart. Not only was the body being burned, but the future, the legacy, the family, the belief in superiority was also being crushed. The temperature in the kitchen continued to rise. Over 55 degrees Celsius, the air was stuffy. The heat from the coal stove wrapped around the body. Some of them were red-faced, panting. Their eyes were glazed over from heat stroke. But Esperanza would not let them fall. She dabbed a wet towel on their foreheads, poured small sips of water into their mouths, just enough to wake them up. You must wake up. You must witness everything. Death is a mercy, and you do not deserve forgiveness. The torture continued throughout the afternoon. The scorching heat, the red-hot steel carved into the flesh. Each time the iron bar touched, a scream shook the thick stone walls. But perhaps the most terrifying thing was not the physical pain. It was the absolute reversal of power. Those who had once considered themselves masters were now toys in the hands of a woman they had once considered unworthy of the name of human. For the first time in their lives, they understood the helplessness of the souls chained to their feet. The most brutal knowledge the 14 men had to swallow in their final moments was the fact that another human being had absolute control over their bodies, their lives, and their souls. For the first time, the self-proclaimed superiors understood what it meant to live as property. As dusk fell, shadows sweeping across the kitchen floor, Esperanza prepared for the finale of her vengeful symphony. The brazier had been burning for 18 hours, the heat rising so high that even breathing became a torment. Each man was dragged closer to the mouth of the brazier just a few feet away, enough to heat their flesh, but not enough to provide a quick release. "This is how you killed Thomas Esperanza," said as she placed Marcus Sutton in front of the red-hot heat. "Do you remember the young man who tried to escape last summer? You locked him in an iron cage in the sun, leaving him to roast alive for 3 days. He begged you for water, for shade, for death. But you laughed, so that others could see his pain. Today, you will experience the same fate." One by one, all 14 were arranged in a circle around the brazier, as if in some monstrous ritual. They were transformed into the very thing they had created, helpless bodies to be used as lessons. The sun set on June 24, 1716, casting darkness over the gruesome scene. 14 of the most powerful men in the land were slowly dying like animals, being roasted over a fire. The screams had stopped, leaving only hoarse, broken moans as their vocal cords were torn from hours of screaming. The kitchen was filled with the smell of burning flesh and desperate gasps. In the corner, Esperanza sat quietly, slowly sharpening her kitchen knife, her lips softly humming the Portuguese lullaby her mother had sung when the village had not yet been burned by raiders. She did not bother to look at the men, only listening to their breathing, to make sure that none of them escaped into unconsciousness before they had tasted the justice she had laid out. By midnight, death had claimed them one by one. Edmund Greyfield, who had once prided himself on being the leader of the Rice Council, was the last to survive. His body, accustomed to privilege, had held out longer than the others. Through his rasping breaths, he whispered, "Please, I can give you money, give you freedom, anything." Esperanza looked up, his eyes calm and cold, just as he had once looked at the slaves being sold in Charleston. "I only want you to die knowing you were wrong. You are not superior to anyone. You are not God's chosen one. You are not a natural master. You are just a man who has chosen the path of evil, and this is the price." Those were the last words that reached Edmund Greyfield's ears before his body collapsed, consumed by fire and thirst from within. The dawn of June 25th, 1716 revealed a sight that no one in the area would forget: 14 charred corpses arranged in a circle around a giant brazier. The bodies were so disfigured that it was difficult to recognize the once powerful faces. And Esperanza de Lima, the Portuguese slave girl, sat silently at the wooden table, still sharpening her knife, still singing a strange song. There was no fatigue on her face, no tears, only the terrifying serenity of someone who had completed her mission. When the white overseers arrived, they were speechless. 14 of the colony's wealthiest men had been taken down by a single woman in a way more brutal than any they had ever imagined. The news was terrifying. If a single slave could do this, what if hundreds, thousands rose up? Within days, news of the massacre spread throughout the region. and with it, the specter of slave masters. For the first time, they feared the very people they had once chained. The entire plantation system was sustained by a simple principle. Slaves had to believe that resistance was futile and that white rule was absolute and eternal. The Greyfield affair had shattered that foundation. But the colonial government knew that if the truth spread, it would be a conflagration that would engulf the entire economy. Governor Robert Johnson immediately convened an emergency council. For 3 days, powerful men argued fiercely, but finally agreed political stability was more important than public justice. The entire Greyfield case was sealed and stored in the Charleston archives with orders not to open it for half a century. To the victims' families, the explanation was simple. A tragic kitchen fire had claimed the lives of 14 men who were meeting to discuss business. Not a single line mentioned the name Esperanza de Lima, but Esperanza could not be ignored. A public execution would reveal the truth, and sparing her life would be an invitation to revolt. Their solution was both cruel and convenient: sell her to a Spanish merchant who supplied labor to the South American silver mines. It was a slow death sentence, since few survived more than 2 years in the mines. But even that carried risks. If Esperanza lived long enough to tell her tale, she would become a symbol of resistance. So, the secret order was given: make her death at sea and make it look like an accident. On July 15, 1716, exactly 3 weeks after the Greyfield massacre, Esperanza and 43 other slaves were loaded onto the Santa Isabella, which set sail from Charleston Harbor. 3 days later, according to the ship's log, she died of fever and was buried at sea. But rumors began to spread. Some swore they had heard Esperanza speak of allies in the New World, ready to rescue her if she made it through the voyage. Some claimed to have seen her whispering to free black sailors on the docks. Many of the slaves at Greyfield claimed that in her final weeks, Esperanza diligently taught them how to identify herbs, perform simple surgery, and above all, how to see through their master's weaknesses. Justice burns slower than coals, but it will burn to the end. The fire I light will spread to other kitchens, other plantations, and burn those who think themselves inviolable. No one knew if those words were true because the government quickly sold Greyfield slaves across the region, cutting off all ties. But the psychological effect was indelible. In the months that followed, a wave of unrest swept through the South Carolina plantations. There were no more mass killings, but signs of trouble. Everywhere, kitchen fires blazed in the dark. Cattle fell to their deaths from mysterious food. Slave drivers were killed at the most vulnerable moments. Tools and weapons disappeared from storage and reappeared in places that could only have been arranged by slave hands. Worst of all, blacks began to know their master's most intimate secrets, habits, transactions, even family schedules. An invisible network seemed to be forming, bridging the once isolated plantations. For the slave-holding class, the psychological impact was deeper than any trauma. Those who had once strolled leisurely around the estates now had guards with them everywhere they went. Routines that had been repeated were constantly changed to avoid the invisible eye that was watching. The Greyfield affair was no longer a hidden accident. It had become a ghost of memory, and the name Esperanza de Lima whispered like a smoldering ember beneath the ashes. The entire plantation system was sustained by a simple principle slaves had to believe: that resistance was futile and that white rule was absolute and eternal. The Greyfield affair had shattered that foundation. But the colonial government knew that if the truth spread, it would be a conflagration that would engulf the entire economy. Governor Robert Johnson immediately convened an emergency council. For 3 days, powerful men argued fiercely, but finally agreed political stability was more important than public justice. The entire Greyfield case was sealed and stored in the Charleston archives with the orders not to open it for half a century. To the victims' families, the explanation was simple. A tragic kitchen fire had claimed the lives of 14 men who were meeting to discuss business. Not a single line mentioned the name Esperanza de Lima, but Esperanza could not be ignored. A public execution would reveal the truth, and sparing her life would be an invitation to revolt. Their solution was both cruel and convenient: sell her to a Spanish merchant who supplied labor to the South American silver mines. It was a slow death sentence, since few survived more than 2 years in the mines. But even that carried risks. If Esperanza lived long enough to tell her tale, she would become a symbol of resistance. So the secret order was given: make her death at sea and make it look like an accident. On July 15th, 1716, exactly 3 weeks after the Greyfield massacre, Esperanza and 43 other slaves were loaded onto the Santa Isabella, which set sail from Charleston Harbor. 3 days later, according to the ship's log, she died of fever and was buried at sea. But rumors began to spread. Some swore they had heard Esperanza speak of allies in the New World ready to rescue her if she made it through the voyage. Some claimed to have seen her whispering to free black sailors on the docks. Many of the slaves at Greyfield claimed that in her final weeks, Esperanza diligently taught them how to identify herbs, perform simple surgery, and above all, how to see through their master's weaknesses. Justice burns slower than coals, but it will burn to the end. The fire I light will spread to other kitchens, other plantations, and burn those who think themselves inviolable. No one knew if those words were true, because the government quickly sold Greyfield's slaves across the region, cutting off all ties. But the psychological effect was indelible. In the months that followed, a wave of unrest swept through the South Carolina plantations. There were no more mass killings, but signs of trouble were everywhere. Kitchen fires blazed in the dark. Cattle fell to their deaths from mysterious food. Slave drivers were killed at the most vulnerable moments. Tools and weapons disappeared from storage and reappeared in places that could only have been arranged by slave hands. Worst of all, blacks began to know their master's most intimate secrets, habits, transactions, even family schedules. An invisible network seemed to be forming, bridging the once isolated plantations. For the slaveholding class, the psychological impact was deeper than any trauma. Those who had once strolled leisurely around the estates now had guards with them everywhere they went. Routines that had been repeated were constantly changed to avoid the invisible eye that was watching. The Greyfield affair was no longer a hidden accident. It had become a ghost of memory, and the name Esperanza de Lima whispered like a smoldering ember beneath the ashes. Slaves no longer believed they were powerless, and in that small shift in the psychological scale, the seeds of the end of slavery in the Americas appeared. After the Greyfield tragedy, strange whispers began to appear from unexpected places. A Spanish merchantman in his personal diary in 1716 recounted that he had met a Portuguese-speaking woman who had been secretly transferred to another ship in Havana. The woman described the plantation system in South Carolina in detail, even pointing out the weaknesses of each slave owner. She said, "The first lesson is a suva, but it will not be the last." The fire started in one kitchen and then spread to many kitchens. No one dared to say for sure whether this was really Esperanza de Lima. But just a few years later, documents from Spanish Florida began to document the emergence of escaped slaves with an unusual amount of knowledge, so detailed that it seemed like an underground intelligence network had been established across British plantations. Intercepted correspondence revealed escape maps, secret codes and strategies for exploiting the psychological weaknesses of their masters. Just 4 years after Greyfield in 1720, the authorities were forced to admit resistance had gone beyond individual escapes. It had become a form of silent warfare. Kitchen fires, strange livestock deaths, and accidental accidents by white overseers were a constant occurrence. And most haunting of all, slaves seemed to know the habits, family secrets, and private dealings of their masters' things they should never have known. The fear was deep and lasting. The rice boards were dissolved forever. Slave masters went about armed, not daring to stick to their fixed habits. Some softened their grip, not out of morals, but out of fear. Others increased the lash and took on more resistance. New laws were enacted tightening the slaves' every move, but instead of extinguishing them, they drove the flames of resistance deeper, smoldering deeper. And so generation after generation, the name Esperanza de Lima became a legend. Parents whispered to their children, "There was a woman who made 14 rulers pay." Children grew up with the story, learning that masters were not invulnerable gods, that wisdom and patience could defeat whips, and swords that justice might be late. But it would never disappear. When the Charleston archives were opened in 1766, Greyfield's secret finally emerged on paper. But the truth has long since flowed through other channels in slave narratives, in escapes, in memories passed down from generation to generation. Whether Esperanza actually survived is no longer a matter of concern. What matters more is the lesson: one man with only his intellect and will can shake a system that seemed eternal. The slave master no longer believed in absolute power. The slave no longer believed in absolute powerlessness. And in that change, resistance movements underground, networks, uprisings, gradually formed and then contributed to the collapse of the plantation system. The Greyfield kitchen, where it all began, stood empty for 66 years. No slave would enter it, for they knew full well that it had taught its master a bloody lesson. In the end, the kitchen was demolished, left to be consumed by weeds. But the memory did not. That memory whispers through the generations. Property can think. Property can plan. And when pushed to the limit, property knows how to take revenge. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns whole. So what do you think? Did Esperanza really survive to continue the fight, or does she only exist in rumors and memories? Leave a comment below. Share your thoughts. And if you want to discover more secrets buried in American history, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video with your friends. Because history is often written by the victors, but sometimes voices from the shadows still find a way to echo through the centuries.